Thank you for that introduction and good morning, everyone. I'm very honoured and proud to have been invited to deliver the 5th Charlie Wolf lecture at the 5th Charlie Wolf Symposium. I'm going to be talking about 30 years of UK EIA regulations, sharing both some of the progress we've made over those 30 years and then looking to the future, but also discussing some of the challenges we've seen along the way. So thank you for the introduction. I'm Josh Fothergill, a fellow of the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment and a chartered environmentalist with over 20 years of EIA experience. Back in 2016, I founded my own consultancy, which predominantly focuses in the UK, doing capacity building around impact assessment, circular economy and skills for sustainability. And on the international side of things, I work as an associate director for Earth Active, currently doing some work developing capacity around environmental social management systems and the performance standards of the IFC over in Nepal. Many of you may know me from my background and work with AEIA and the time I spent leading AEMA, the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment over in the UK. And a number of the things I'll talk about today, I suppose, reflect the influence of that organisation's work and the dedicated EIA community and professionals of the UK that have helped progress that. What am I going to cover in today's presentation? Well, today I'm going to cover an overview of the UK's EIA regulations so you can understand kind of where we're coming from. I'll talk about the UK EIA process. I suspect it will be similar to the process over in Nigeria, but I'm sure there will be some differences. And certainly my work and conversations with professionals at AEIA conferences over the years have highlighted a number of differences. So just so that we're all clear, I thought I'd run us through the UK's EIA process. In the middle part of the lecture, I'll be talking about the progress that the UK has made over the years towards good EIA practices and some of my perspectives on what's driven that. And then go and focus on perhaps some of those challenges that we see in actually maintaining effective EIA. It's not simply about delivering good practice and then it will remain static. In fact, there's a level of maintenance that's needed, and there's various things that arise and come up that need to be responded to. And talking of that, that's where I'll end the lecture today, where I'll be looking at the future drivers of UK EIA practice into the 2020s, and perhaps some of those you'll be able to reflect across in your discussions later today in relation to practice and developments and trends in Nigerian EIA. So, on to an overview of the UK's EIA regulations. Just to say, the photos you'll see through the slides are all from Northern Ireland. I thought I'd just take an array of different photos from one of the UK's different nations, so they're all available there. But the UK's regulations, well, where do we start? Well, UK EIA started in the late 1970s, really as kind of voluntary practice, particularly in the offshore oil and gas sectors. But in terms of the regulations, the UK gets all its EIA law and the basis of its environmental impact assessment law from the European Union's EIA directive. I can imagine there might be some chuckles in the room given that just last couple of weeks ago the UK left the European Union. I will talk about in terms of the coming decade challenges and kind of future trends what Brexit might mean for UK EIA practice, but it is very true to say that the UK's EIA approach and our regulations are entirely based on the European Union's approach. Now, through the 1980s, the UK was actually quite a fundamental part of discussing what EIA would look like in the European Union, and helped to contribute to the creation of that first directive, 85337 EEC. And these transposition dates, the red column here, these are the dates when the UK had to bring all its regulations into force. So since July 1988, the UK has had EIA regulations in place, and then we've moved forward since then. Probably the most substantial change was in 1997 when the directive changed then. 2 years later in 1999 the UK changed its regulations, brought in its modern screening process to identify what type of developments might require EIA, brought in factors in relation to how the EIA is scoped, who must be consulted in those early stages to decide what topics should be involved, and also brought the kind of shape of the environmental impact statement into being. And after 1999 we see a significant increase in the number of EIAs, or environmental impact statements, being submitted each year in the UK, roughly a doubling as a result of that change in legislation. So 1999, I suppose, is really kind of the birth or the beginning of kind of modern UK EIA practice. A number of other changes occurred through the early 2000s. The first one was in 2005, bringing in expectations around a piece of international law that had come into both the UK and the European Union, the Aarhus Convention, access to public participation and those type of activities. And the 2011 change to the UK regulations brought in the potential for carbon capture and storage projects that are going to store carbon dioxide in geological storage in the ground, brought those within the scope of the EIA directive. There was a big consolidation of all those kind of changes at the European level in 2011, but nothing required at the UK level. And then in 2017, so just over 3 years ago, we see the most recent changes come in to the EIA process in the UK. So moving on. In terms of, that gives the kind of history, I suppose, of potted history of the regulations, so starting in 1998 and moving through to changes in 2017. It's fair to say EIA in the UK has been rather bolted onto the process rather than perhaps built in from the start. So some European member states kind of integrated EIA into their consenting process as they were developing it. But the UK already had a strong tradition of planning and consenting. As a consequence, EIA was really kind of attached to the side of existing consenting processes. So EIA is decision support. It doesn't make the decision. You need to have satisfied the regulations in order to progress to gain your consent, but it is there to provide support into the decision-making process that is made by elected officials, rather than the EIA itself and its findings actually determining whether consent can move ahead or not. And because EIA has kind of been linked into the UK system that was already established around consenting, and then over time the UK is going through a process of devolution. So there was England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and each of those nations have the ability to set the environmental laws within their boundaries, as a consequence of which the UK actually has over 20 sets of EIA regulations. And what you can see on that slide there is around 10 of the sets of regulations that can apply within England. The top one, town and country planning, is the most commonly followed. Probably around 80% of EIA in the UK happens under town and country planning regulations. Major infrastructure projects, things that are nationally significant, occur under these newer regulations. And then there are various others related to water resource project, land drainage, offshore oil and gas, forestry, agriculture, etc. that can apply. Moving on from the types of regulations. In 2017, with the changes that came in, the UK finally got an actual legal definition of what EIA is. So rather than, I suppose, EIA as a consultant, which I tend to be these days, being the work of the consultant alongside the developer, actually that's just the first aspect of the UK's legal definition of EIA. So the preparation of that environmental impact statement by a developer or by consultants on behalf of a developer is just the first of 5 parts of the legal definition. The rest of the activity actually is undertaken by the government, often a council, a local authority, and they undertake the consultation on the environmental impact statement and the developer's application. They then take that information, both the environmental impact statement findings and the consultation responses. They're required to examine that, and from that they come to their own reasoned conclusions as to what the significant environmental effects are. So they don't just have to believe the environmental impact statement, they're looking across the evidence provided by that document and the evidence provided by statutory government consultees and by the public, and they're weighing all that up and making a judgment. And they've got to put their recent conclusions on significant effects into the decision-making process, so that's often a report to the elected officials, and then the elected officials take that into account alongside various other pieces of information on the application. When a decision is made, there's now a formal requirement for publicity and a publicly available decision notice to allow people to understand how a decision was made, what environmental mitigation and conditions are required, and whether they wish to try and challenge that decision through the courts. So what's really become clear over time is that there's since 2017, there's a lot more emphasis on the government's role, the consenting authority's role in delivering effective EIA in the UK, and kind of placing that emphasis on that aspect of things. Moving on to the UK's EIA process, so we understand the regulations now, or at least you understand them in part, and where the history has come from those regulations. The process itself, hopefully this is relatively familiar. We start up here, and we start with the fact that something needs to be being proposed. A developer, be it the government or be it a private sector, has to come up with a change, something that needs consent, a development consent. And oftentimes we forget that it starts with that. But in terms of where the regulations kick in, the first stage we term screening, identifying whether an EIA is actually needed or not. For certain projects, there's an automatic requirement for EIA, large motorway projects, runways for international airports, large power stations, etc. But for many, many more projects, there is a screening process where the local authority, the council, planning officers have to go through a process of considering whether that project is likely to have significant effects or not. And they're assisted by a list of type of projects that can be covered, and they're assisted by criteria. If something is above those criteria, then they will screen it. If it's below them and not in a sensitive environmental area as designated by the government, then EIA won't be required. Where it's determined an EIA is needed, we move on to scoping, and this is where the initial engagement occurs. This is really a developer-led process where the developer has been told they need to do an EIA, they take on board consultants, and the consultants will work on what environmental issues should be involved and hopefully engage local groups, the local community, NGOs, as well as government bodies who have environmental responsibilities. However, there is a formal process in the regulations. It's a voluntary process, but a developer can go to a council and ask for a formal scoping opinion and say, you're going to be the ones consenting this development at a later stage or making that decision. What issues do you think should be involved? And if they make that voluntary request to the council is required to speak to the Environment Agency, Natural England, various statutory government bodies that have environmental responsibility, and draw that information together, provide it back to the developer, ideally within 5 weeks, but it often takes longer than that. The process then goes back to the developer, and they will iterate, looking at their design, assessing its issues, and ideally looking at alteration, mitigation and enhancement to ideally come up with the best project for the environment and the community that can come forwards. That doesn't always happen, but we are seeing increasingly developers in the UK taking more account of sustainability criteria in how they design their projects. And the assessment, the baseline environment, the impacts of the construction and operation phase, possibly decommissioning, the evaluation of significance, mitigation, enhancement, is all written up in an environmental statement or environmental impact statement. That's submitted to the local authority. Consultation occurs on that, public consultation for a minimum of 30 days. And at the end of that process, this is where the increased role comes in of the council, the examination of the information from the environmental statement and the consultations to determine the council's view as to what its recent conclusions are about significance. If they feel the environmental statement hasn't covered things adequately, or they feel there's information missing to make those recent conclusions, they can go back along this dotted line and make a further information request, and the developer must submit that additional information to enhance the environmental statement, and that document itself must go through again 30 days of consultation as a minimum. Once they're satisfied, it moves on to the decision-making process made by the elected officials, and if it gets consented, then the mitigation, the monitoring requirements would be put into conditions and put into that consent process and obviously implemented either during construction or operation. Is that the end of the process? Well, no, there is this opportunity that potentially there might be conditions that require the developer to come back to the council for approval, and those themselves may need or trigger the need for more EIA work, possibly further information to the environmental statement, or in some cases, a new environmental assessment can be required depending on the scale of change that occurs. So moving on, the type of topics that we assess in EIA within the UK, well, they're set out in the regulations. So we're required to consider impacts on population, human health, biodiversity, land, soil, water, air and climate, material assets, cultural heritage and landscape. And then consider the interaction between those issues as to whether perhaps mitigation to reduce landscape or visual impacts might cause some impacts in one of the other topic areas. In addition, we need to look at cumulative effects with other projects that are coming forward in the area, and also since 2017, whether a project, if it were to suffer a major accident or a disaster, would that change the consequences, the significant environmental effects to human health, biodiversity, land, water, soil, etc. So there's quite a range of topics, but just to be clear, we're not talking here about having a chapter on each of these. The regulations only require us to consider them. So we can look at them and say, this isn't relevant, this isn't going to be significantly affected, here is my evidence, and this is why we haven't assessed it in lots of detail. Unfortunately, UK practice isn't as good as that as it could be, and we do lead to quite a lot of detailed assessments, as I'll come on to later. So moving on from that coverage of the regulations to look at progress of good EIA practices in the UK, I thought I'd take us through a history perhaps of that development of good practice and kind of where it's come from. So looking into that, what we first see is an inception period when the regulations first came into the process, 1988 to 1990, those first 3 years. Some research undertaken at that point, environmental impact statements often less than 75 pages, only 3 environmental topics often covered, and generally written by a single author. The author was perhaps a specialist in ecology or landscape, and maybe felt that they could have an attempt at a couple of the other topics. So even though 3 topics were covered, oftentimes it was quite weakly covered. Overall, I think the quality at that point could really be described as ineffective. It moved on from that, and after that we get stabilisation. So around the next kind of 10 years, the 1990s, Professor Glasson from Oxford Brookes University produced a report and said what we really need to see EIA take hold in the UK is to focus on quality, focus on professionalism. And what we began to see in that period is the core topic guidance coming through, key documents from professional bodies around how to assess ecology, how to assess landscape and visual impacts, how to assess noise and transport and traffic impacts. And overall, the quality of EIA significantly improves during the 1990s. When we get to the first 10 years, first decade of the new millennium, from kind of 2000 to 2010, we really see a modernisation, the overall quality of UK EIA being kind of really considered to be good quality. We see an EIA coordinator role who leads the EIA process, brings together the specialists, make sure they're kind of focusing and undertaking and up to date with and communicating with the design team. And then we see the specialists coming in, so dedicated professionals who are ecologists or maybe even ornithologists to just produce a chapter on the impacts for birds, specialists in perhaps marine mammals coming in and producing specific chapters in relation to offshore impacts. We really see very much a professionalisation of the industry during this period. However, what's kind of, I suppose, never really been resolved is our focus on quality has pushed us more towards quantity. The more professional we've become, the more we've looked to improve things. We've looked to build upon the last report. We produced 20 pages last time, maybe we should produce 30 next time because we want to add a bit more in. And what we really see here is concerns beginning to arise, particularly about the environmental impact statement, about the quantity of it. So the quality is still considered good of the information that's there, but there's so much information that actually the message we want to come out of our EIA is becoming ineffective. And that's something I'll talk about in one of the challenges slightly later on. So to think of another aspect of quality and kind of good practice in the UK, we step back a decade ago, 2010, and in 2010, the Institute for Environmental Management and Assessment, and AEMA, launched what's called the EIA quality mark. And that's something, while I was there, that was something that I produced and put forward. And some of you who've been coming to AEIA conferences around the world over the last decade may well have heard me talk about this. And this is a voluntary code of practice, so it's not something coming from the government, it's something that practice has developed itself. But it's something that is demanded in kind of contract documents and is really seen as, I suppose, an access to market for many of the big consultancies. So currently in 2020, 58 registrants, mainly consultancies, registered to that, and over 75% of the UK's environmental impact statements being produced by organisations registered within that scheme. What we do see, the logo has changed over 10 years, but very little else has really changed in the last 10 years. So there's an annual review that's undertaken for each of these 58 registrants, and it looks across 7 commitments they've made to good quality and good quality practice in EIA. How do they manage their EIA processes across their organisation? How do they ensure their teams have the right capability? Those 2 things are examined by interview. The next 4, regulatory compliance, context and influence, content and presentation. We look at environmental impact statements. Are they meeting the regulatory requirements? Are they setting out how alternatives design and scoping was conducted? Do they set out the baseline, the assessment and significance? Is the presentation effective to be able to see the information that's needed? And then the final one is about improving practice. Everyone contributing and putting in a share of effort of those 58 organisations, giving some staff time to try and move practice forward. And that creates a huge amount of time and energy available to enhance UK EIA. So moving on from the idea of the EIA quality mark, the time available from organisations that we see kind of in this blue ring here, what we really have tried to do in the UK, and I've really tried to push forward, is this idea of establishing active EIA communities of professionals, be they from the government side, from the consultant side, from developers, from government environmental organisations, to really try and advance EIA practice. And you can see here individuals working together, a kind of network of a community of volunteers, the organisations who put their time in, and a kind of leadership at the front of that helps to produce lots of CPD. This is continuing professional development, webinars, training, guidance documents that help to keep the whole thing moving and progressing forward. Now, my perspective from maybe just over a decade ago was that, all EIA professionals need to feel as part of the same community in the UK. We really need to require an active community, so we need to have leadership that's encouraging it, and that creating resilience and stability across that community is absolutely key to making this work. And I think actually, having left AEMA now and reflecting since 2018, when I did go into consultancy, what's happened since then is perhaps AEMA has perhaps taken a little bit of a step back, but there's been a lot of other groups, the Royal Town Planning Institute and various other organisations that have stepped forward and made a real change in relation to EIA. So I'd say from now, it's, we definitely need that supporters and leaders, but they change. You can't stop that. So you just need to accept that and embrace that. The people who are leading the EIA community now might not be the same in 5 years or 10 years. Some of them may be the same, some may have changed. We need to accept that dynamic. Multiple coexisting communities can actually be really useful to provide resilience. If one community is struggling, their leadership has left or whatever, others can step in and help to keep practice going, keep good practice established. But that encouragement is absolutely key between individuals, from the leaders, from the government, from professional organisations. That's really what keeps it all moving and ticking over and advancing together. And what do we see coming from this? Well, in the UK practice, what we see here is a whole series of guidance documents that have come forward, produced by active practitioners, not by the government, not by statutory bodies, not by councils, but by practitioners volunteering their time, working together. In 2010, 2 principles documents around how climate change might fit into EIA, the greenhouse gas mitigation and the adaptation. 2011, a kind of fundamental report on how the state of UK practice was at that time, feeding into changes to the European directive. Key guidance documents updated on landscape and visual impact assessment, on noise, environmental noise impact assessment, and then based on these principles documents, more detailed guidance about climate change resilience, greenhouse gas in EIA and its significance, how we might think about health in EIA, which was one of the topics added in 2017, or at least enhanced in its coverage. And then in recent years, more kind of perspective pieces on how proportionate EIA can be delivered, nationally significant infrastructure projects in EIA, and concepts of net gain, which I'll talk about towards the end of my presentation. Moving on to the challenges that we see. Well, in terms of challenges, there are challenges to maintain effective practice. It isn't simply just about getting good practice and it stays, it has to be maintained. I think a key thing we need to be aware of is, in the UK, EIA comes in, here it is in the centre, circa 1988. That's fantastic, but since then we've had huge amounts of other change in the last 30 years. Lots of new environmental regulation has come forward to protect particular habitats and species, to protect the water environment that require plans and different assessments, to manage the operational emissions and permitting processes for industrial processes. All of these processes have been updated or come in since EIA has come in and added complexity. The government itself has brought forward lots of new planning policy within the consent regime, not within the EIA process. So a national framework within England looking to try and deliver biodiversity net gain. At the local level within councils, they have lists of many different small assessments that could be needed, from visual impact, flood risk assessment, biodiversity, etc. And increasingly an expectation within those policies for health impact assessment for projects that may never require an EIA. In the private sector, we've seen a whole range of different tools come up that try and produce kind of a series of questions that will analyse designs. So the Building Research Establishment's environmental assessment method, BREEAM, SQL is one that is a very similar type of methodology, but more for industrial infrastructure projects. Many carbon calculators coming into the private sector, coming in from the engineering and design side. And then on the international side, initiatives around ecosystem services, like the IFC's Performance Standard 6 back in 2012, bringing in ecosystem services. How does the UK look and think about that? The Sustainable Development Goals, how does EIA adapt to those? The climate emergency. So EIA has become one of many over the last 30 years, and that's a real challenge for it to stay interesting, for it to stay kind of positive, and for it to take a prominent role within the process. Another challenge we see in the UK is capacity challenges. You might be surprised about this, but there still is a lack of EIA knowledge and experience. That's not uncommon, particularly within local authorities. EIA knowledge, enhancement and capacity building is a continuous effort in any country around the world. Resources are always limited and spread across many initiatives. I just mentioned many of those on the last slide. All of those initiatives requiring training, requiring time, requiring thought. And if EIA has been around a long time, then it can be very difficult to get the resources needed in order to keep training up to date and moving forward. Less than half of the councils in the UK actually receive an environmental impact statement each year, so many councils won't see it as a priority to keep EIA skills up to date because there's around 400,000 planning applications made to councils in England each year, but only around 450 environmental impact statements are required across those. So, only 0.2% of applications are you going to prioritise that as an area to invest in? And training budgets are often some of the first areas to be cut. Staff change as well. People get promoted, change profession, change councils, and may not have the same role when they get to the new council. But there are efforts being made across the UK. AEMA and the RTPI as professional bodies deliver activity, webinars and training, and then the Scottish Government, the Welsh Government, the Northern Irish Government are all undertaking activities or have done in order to try and advance EIA, train local authorities, keep people up to date. And then what you see there is a book that I published alongside Barbara Carroll, Trevor Turpin and Joe Murphy last year, which is a practitioner book, kind of taking you through the regulations in the UK and how to apply effective practice. Moving on, another area of challenge for UK is judicial review and case law. Many legal challenges around the EIA process, and EIA has to respond to that. Practice has to understand how that moves forward. So in terms of these challenges, some of the major ones that have come out over the years, the EIA has a broad scope and a wide purpose. So just because a project isn't specifically listed within the regulations doesn't mean that EIA cannot apply to it. Solar farms, solar energy projects are not listed in the regulations, but regularly undergo EIA. Recycling centres aren't listed under the regulations specifically, but waste management facilities are, and the definition of waste within UK law represents recycling of material as well, therefore they're covered. The demolition of a site in order to prepare it for a future development can be a change and can trigger EIA, particularly if the existing building has heritage status and needs to be considered and protected, even if that building itself isn't necessarily protected under the law. So all of these changes have come in, and there are many other changes and case law that comes forward each year, and practice has to be aware of this, it has to be disseminated, and then practice has to respond to it and understand how that moves forward. And unless you have that active group of practitioners who can disseminate that information, talk about it, consider practice, then it can be very hard to rise up to these challenges that come out of the courts. Moving on from case law, and I guess probably the biggest challenge in UK practice is disproportionate EIA. What do I mean by this? Well, the EIA process losing its value because of the amount of detail both within the process itself, how long it takes, but in particularly in the documents, the environmental impact statements and their appendices that come forward. We had warnings about this from the courts back in 2005. They can't intervene, but they were highlighting that documents were beginning to get unwieldy. And certainly 10 years on from that, by 2015, for the last 5 years, the UK has seen multiple environmental impact statements over 25,000 pages long. And in fact, one of the longest we've seen was nearly 60,000 pages for the High-Speed 2 rail project. And that was just the first phase of that project. There are 2 more phases and 2 more EIAs to come forward for that. But it's perhaps not surprising given the fact that back in 2010, the average UK environmental impact statement contained nearly 10 topic chapters. So these are environmental chapters, not all the other things that need to go in. And this didn't cover many of the big topics that have come in since 2017, climate change, health, major accidents and disasters. So many topics being included in the scope of EIA and being then assessed by professionals to a professional level of quality. But the difficulty is, how do we get to the essence of the information that's needed for the decision, the significant information, the key argument and messages, the key evidence for mitigation that's needed when it's lost within hundreds and hundreds of pages of documents. So that's a real challenge. UK practice has risen to that challenge and taken proactive action. In 2017, it launched a proportionate EIA strategy, and you can see a copy of that on the screen, and that focused on 4 key areas. Trying to enhance people, a capacity building programme, trying to improve the use of the scoping process so that it does actually focus on critical activity that the EIA needs to look at. Recognising it's a shared responsibility. Consultants can't do this on their own, government can't do this on its own, NGOs can't do this on its own. We all need to work together if EIA is to deliver the quality we wish to see. And then a need to embrace innovation in wider practices and digital innovations as well. And I'll talk about that in the next series of slides. So to move on to my final section, the future drivers of UK EIA practice in the 2020s, I guess there's one thing I really cannot ignore. 11 p.m, 31st of January this year, the UK left the European Union. And Brexit, as I mentioned earlier, the UK's EIA laws have all come from the European Union. So, do we have difficulties? Well, regulations came in to fix the technicalities so that on the 31st of January, the law pointed back to UK overarching law rather than European law. So EIA still continues to function in the UK. But of course, there is now the potential opportunity for change. The government is very unlikely to delete EIA in the UK, but I think some kind of review and reform of the process is likely. The regulations, in fact, that were set out in 2017 have a 5-year review process on them anyway. So by May 2022, in around 2.5 years, or just under 2.5 years' time, the UK would be looking to review the effectiveness of its EIA regulations and decide if changes were needed. So potentially over that kind of period, we can see the need for and the likelihood of some kind of review of the EIA process. This might be to limit EIA further and say, well, actually we only need it for the very big projects, the very troublesome projects, those with really the most significant environmental effects. Or there could be a more fundamental review to look at the EIA process alongside the planning system and say, well, in many times we're doing very similar impact assessment type work within planning. Maybe we need to bring these areas together, and there could be an opportunity for a kind of integration of many of those different things I showed you on the challenges slide about the complexity of the consenting regime and the type of assessments that can be needed. There could be a real opportunity to rationalise that within the framework of EIA. But we will just have to see how things come and keep reporting those to AEIA and be happy to come and speak about those in the future. Probably the bigger challenge that's coming for practice at the moment, though, is what's called net gain. The planning system within England has an expectation that planning and developments that come forward will deliver biodiversity net gain, and some principles, practice, guidance and kind of examples have been produced around this. And the government, certainly in England, is looking at an environment bill at the moment. It's passing through the Houses of Parliament, and this would expect 10% net gain to be delivered by every project that gains a planning consent. Now, at the moment, the government is debating whether this is biodiversity net gain and whether the 10% benefit should be to biodiversity. So if your project were to damage 5 hectares of land, it would need to improve 5.5 hectares somewhere else, be that locally or further away, or whether this should be environmental net gain. Now, environmental net gain has pluses and minuses, because in environmental net gain there is the risk that you could erode biodiversity and reduce biodiversity if you improve perhaps the visual side of things, human health, and maybe some archaeological benefits to the overall gain. So the government is reviewing tools and activities around this. Unfortunately, this has been quite separate from the EIA community. So how EIAs will respond to this expectation for net gain, it will have to fit into the process somehow. But is a biodiversity net gain a likely significant effect, as is what EIA is required to look at, or is it something different? And how we bring these two together, how we bring these professional communities together, and we don't end up with even more assessments, a biodiversity net gain assessment alongside an EIA, alongside a habitats regulation assessment and a flood assessment. How we bring this process together so that it's effective as one is something we really need to understand in the UK, and is a challenge for practice at the moment. Another area that needs to be considered is digital EIA. Now, this isn't just a digital environmental impact statement, as you see on the screen there on a nice tablet, where you can zoom in and perhaps go on a website and look at how a development might look and engage with the document in a different manner. although those things are very impressive and we're increasingly seeing examples of them, particularly in the non-technical summary documents that developers produce. But we are seeing examples of websites that are designed for scoping. People can go in and leave comments, or even entire environmental impact statements that are online and kind of interactive. But in order to achieve that, there has to be agreement, there has to be thought about this process all the way from the start of the EIA process. It isn't simply a case of doing a normal EIA and then saying, okay, we're not going to produce this into a Words document or a PDF, we're going to build a website. If you're going to embrace digital EIA, you really need to integrate that at the start, and that means bringing different skills into the project team. Digital specialists, visualization specialists, and those kind of things who can think about this interaction and design the process so that it works and is efficient. There do seem to be the potential to make the documents more focused, make the documents more engaging, and that could be very, very useful for the UK's challenges around proportionate EIA. But we still will need to address, even if we get digital environmental impact statements that are very, very interesting and engaging, we'll still need to address the depth of scope that's going on, the amount of information that's being gathered. And there's always a challenge that says, with a printed document, that is the document, and then you can print a supplementary section, or you have a date on it and you understand what is on the public record. But who maintains a digital environmental impact statement into the future? How do you manage changes in that document? How do you keep the original version and have the later versions on a live website? All of these are challenges that need to be addressed as we move more towards digital EIA. And beyond this, there then comes the interesting challenge of things like artificial intelligence and how we might bring that into the process of assessing impacts. You know, will that replace the professional, or is it something that's going to supplement the professional? I personally think, certainly initially at least, in the next decade, it's going to be something that's going to supplement us and help us focus rather than replace us. But I guess we'll see. The final trend, just to finish off and bring things to a close, is to say that I think the major trend for UK practice kind of moving forward is that we will maintain passionate and dedicated EIA professionals who are working in different communities around the UK and continuing to be at the forefront of shaping and pushing forward practice around impact assessment, around environmental assessment within consenting, both in the UK and hopefully also internationally through engaging in activities like this Charlie Wolf Symposium, like the AEIA conference in Seville in May. And what you've got on the screen there is just one of those communities' activities. Myself, as Fothergill Training and Consulting, partnered with the Scottish Government and 3 government environmental bodies. And for the last 4 years, we've run a conference that's free to attend for 120 professionals. And we come together from councils, from consultancies, from developers, and we talk about different issues that are relevant to Scottish practice, and then that information gets disseminated via a website and hopefully kind of keeps practice going, keeps that ongoing capacity building, which is so essential if you are to maintain quality and good practice across a national EIA regime. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you for listening to me. And if there are any questions, I'd be very happy to answer those now. My contact details are on the screen if you want to email any questions and understand any further detail. Thank you very much for inviting me to deliver the 5th Charlie Wolf lecture at the 5th Charlie Wolf Symposium. Thank you for your time.